Today we're talking with Stephen Pavlovich, CEO of Conversion.com, and I'll be asking him how you can and why you should be using experimentation to manage risk and how you can create a risk profile for your own or your client's business. My name is Guido Jansen and welcome to the Zero Cafe, the podcast where I show you the behind the scenes of optimization teams and talk with their specialists about data and human-driven optimization and implementing a culture of experimentation and validation. In case you missed it, in the previous English episode, we spoke about server-side testing with Ruben de Boer and Tom van den Berg from Online Dialogue. And you can listen to that episode on the Zero Cafe website or in the podcast app you're listening with right now. This episode of Zero Cafe is made possible by our partners Online Dialogue, SiteSpec, Online Influence Institute, Content Square, and Convert.com. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 37. Stephen, welcome back to the Zero Cafe. And before we dive into our main topic, I wanted to ask you about something you said at the Digital Elite Conference in April last year. And you expressed the hope that people in Zero in 2019 will start answering bigger questions. So instead of just optimizing landing pages or just forms or, dare I say, button colors, we should all focus more on the actual product offering, pricing schemes, or the markets that companies address. How far do you think we are in this?
I would say for the most part, we're pretty early on in that journey. I think there's a long way for us to go in terms of what we can do to test that.
Yeah.
It feels like at the moment, most people are kind of typically testing changes that they would make anyway. In other words, if A/B testing didn't exist, would you still make this change? And for most people, they probably would. So they're kind of testing something that they consider to be best practice or a kind of logical idea. And so in doing that, it doesn't really kind of stray too far from what they would do anyway. And I think that undervalues the role that experimentation can play.
Feels more like a safeguard. Like, okay, I want to do this, but I don't want to feel too big. So let's check this before we put it live.
Yeah, I mean, or sometimes it's not. It's a safeguard implies that you could potentially fail. Like sometimes I feel like the reason why people run A/B tests is to see how clever they are. Like, I've got this idea. Let's test it, and then I can use that to show how much of a good idea it was to do it. I think a lot of the time people aren't testing concepts that are bold enough to fail in a big way. And obviously you shouldn't be looking to fail in a big way, but you should be testing ideas that have the potential to go at opposite ends of the spectrum, as opposed to just kind of oscillating around the middle.
Yeah.
So I think it's still a very fair point that a lot of people are kind of testing fairly simple concepts that are kind of, I guess, what they might expect to see on a competitor's website. Whereas experimentation should give us the power to test pretty much anything. It's like we have a whole kind of alternate reality where we get to play God. We get to kind of create that new experience and decide what it should be, and then see whether it performs better or not. But then people still kind of keeping it so close to what they have already.
And why do you think that is? Is it like the corporate culture? Are we not exploring enough? Don't we dare enough to do exceptional things or the extreme things? Or
I certainly think that the culture is part of it, but I think also the culture point can only be used as an excuse so far. I think it goes both ways. The culture is, by its nature, the people and how they act. And so it's on us as experimenters, I guess, to help inform and change that culture. So yes, certainly the culture is part of it. And a lot of the time when people within a company want to run a bold experiment, they get pushback and people don't want to do it. And that's totally fair enough. But there's still ways around that. I think a big part of it is also that we don't always, and this applies just as much to myself as anyone else, we don't always have the imagination or inspiration to put forward those bolder concepts. When you're looking to optimize a website, the temptation is, right, let's look at what it looks like today and come up with some ideas for what we can test. And you tend to keep it fairly close to what is already there. You don't tend to come up with the bold and more creative ideas, the throw it out and start again concepts if you do that.
Yeah.
So I think it's certainly culture is part of it, but it's also on us as CRO professionals to push that forward and try and change it.
And I want to hear more from you later on in this episode about how to come up with more disruptive ideas.
Sure.
And this is a nice segue into the blog post you created about using experimentation to manage risk or create a risk profile. I think that's an important part in becoming more disruptive. You need to be aware of the risk you're having. So first off, what is a risk profile? Let's start with that one.
Sure. So I think everybody has a risk profile in their experimentation strategy, whether they know it or actively manage it or not. By its nature, some experiments that you do will be low risk. They will be iterations of something that you have tested before and you saw work. And others will be medium risk. That might be where you're testing a completely new concept, but it's unlikely to have an effect outside of the experiment itself. In other words, when you stop the experiment, that's when you limit the impact. And then there could be high-risk experiments. So these are ones where it's potentially more likely to have an effect even after you've stopped the experiment. So if you're testing pricing, if you're a relatively high-profile company and you're testing something that people might pick up on social media or in the press, for example, then those are likely to be higher risk experiments. So most companies will be doing a mix of these experiments already, mostly low and medium risk experiments typically. My belief is that companies should be managing a fairly balanced portfolio, including some high risk experiments, because ultimately those are the ones that your competitors are less likely to run. Those are the ones that will give you the competitive advantage. Those are the ones that will help you go from the local maxima to the global maxima. In other words, rather than helping you to optimize and iterate on what you already have, it can show you where there's a much greater potential elsewhere. And you'll only get that by testing those more radical concepts.
Yeah, you already mentioned those competitors, but not running an experiment is also a risk, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's entirely fair. And it's something that often people will overlook. Not running an experiment can mean either changing a website without testing it, which is obviously quite a significant risk, or not changing a website and leaving it as it is because you're too afraid to touch it, which again is a significant risk because hopefully your competitors would be testing and optimizing and continuing to evolve. And in doing so, they are gaining a significant advantage over you. So you can't do nothing. You can't change your website without test it. So you have to test in a logical and scalable way.
Yeah.
And to do so means getting the balance right between those low, medium, and high risk tests.
So I think many CRO practitioners already use a framework for prioritizing tests. Would you say that's very similar to a risk profile, or do we need to add something to it? Or
I must admit, I struggle with a lot of the prioritization methods out there. This is probably a whole other podcast. But for me, I think the challenge with a lot of prioritization methods is that at their core, it essentially comes down to a fairly subjective belief, which is at some point you're going to be asked essentially what is the expected impact of this test.
Yeah.
The problem with that is it's very subjective. Your idea for potential impact might be different to mine for the same experiment. It becomes very hard to do that in a consistent, logical way. And as that is one of the main driving factors behind how you prioritize your experiments, it then starts to call into question the whole value of that prioritization method. The approach that we use is a little bit different. We try to make it as data-driven as possible, with the data being the evidence that you've gained either from previous experiments or from customer research, and using that to inform the prioritization. So we talk about this quite a bit on our blog, where we talk about the SCORE prioritization method. But yeah, I think I wouldn't have thought that risk is necessarily something that comes into most people's prioritization methods. Even the SCORE methodology, when we wrote that blog post, I don't know that we necessarily, in fact, no, I don't think we did factor risk as a significant effect into that at the time either. So it's certainly something that needs to evolve.
For over 10 years now, Online Dialogue advises about evidence-based conversion optimization with a focus on data and psychology. We see that analyzing data and recognizing customer behavior results in a better online dialogue with your clients and a higher ROI. The team of strategists, analysts, psychologists, and UX specialists gathers valuable insights in the online behavior of your visitors, and together with you, they optimize the different elements of your CRO program through redesign, expert reviews, A/B tests, and behavioral analysis. For more information about their services, go to onlinedialogue.com. But is that the moment that you usually do the prioritization for your experiments? Is it also the moment you would evaluate those risk factors? Or?
Yeah, so it's normally when we're doing the ideation phase. So prioritization is typically something that it's not a kind of one-off event. In my belief, most people treat it as though you come up with a list of 20 experiments and then you want to prioritize them and decide in which order you should do it. In my opinion, that's probably far too late to be prioritizing. You should start much sooner than that. Typically, you should be prioritizing at the area, audience, and lever level. In other words, you should prioritize the areas on your website, so you know that testing on the product page is going to be higher priority than testing on the homepage, for example. You should prioritize based on the audiences too. So we should be prioritizing mobile visitors over desktop, for example. And then you can prioritize on the lever. Lever being the kind of key hypothesis behind the experiment. So it might be trust or delivery or pricing, for example, these kind of core principles, because then you can cluster your experiments around those. You can get an understanding of which work and which don't. So that way you can say, okay, we know that the highest priority is to test on the product page and on mobile traffic, and the delivery lever has the highest win rate so far. So therefore, we need to come up with the best next experiment to run on that page, on that audience, on that lever. And that way, you've already done a lot of the prioritization work before you even start on the ideation process.
Yeah.
And all you have to do is come up with the best next experiment. You don't have to come up with a list of 20 different concepts and then try to prioritize those based on, well, I think my idea is going to have a higher impact than yours, and vice versa. So it becomes much more objective as a result if you do that.
And so when you're running these more disruptive experiments, I can imagine you get a lot of backlash from the companies saying, okay, but if we do this, we need to overhaul our whole department, or the way we do marketing, or the way we do business in general. How do you respond to that? How do you help them understand that, hey, this is actually important for you to do, because otherwise in a year you might not have any customers? Or
Yeah, totally. I mean, we always look to, it's that same phrase that I mentioned a second ago, the best next experiment. So what we're trying to create is not the perfect solution for any given problem. We're trying to create the best next experiment.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is we wouldn't say to a company, you have to do this, and this means overhauling your entire department or structure or your value proposition. We want to use experimentation to inform that. And so it's kind of like the, taking the next step on the journey.
Yeah, because I see a lot of people that are unfamiliar with experiments, that if they see those experiments up front, and then they already assume, okay, but if this is proven somehow, then we need to implement it and we need to overhaul everything to accommodate whatever the result from that experiment is.
But then that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like if you run the experiment and it shows you should be doing X, and this is how much better it will be for your customers and for your business, then you have your ready-made business case there.
Or at least it's food for thought and
exactly
food for more experiments, saying, hey, apparently we can do much better.
Precisely.
Let's explore this more.
And if you decide not to do it, then you know the potential impact of that. Absolutely.
Exactly.
One thing that we will always do is, in terms of kind of taking those baby steps, is we'll look to start with something. I guess there are two ways of doing it. You can either start with a big goal and scale it down to a very simple concept that you can test next. Or you can start with something fairly simple, and then you test that. And if it works, you test something else, and again and again and again, until you scale it over time in terms of the potential impact that it has. So for one of our clients, they were a medical client, and we knew that every time we tested delivery as a lever, it was successful. So if we added, if we promoted free delivery in the navigation, for example, that was successful. If we reminded people about that when they were on the product page and the checkout, that was successful as well. If we spoke about the speed of delivery, that was successful. And we knew that essentially every test that we did around delivery seemed to be successful. And it got to the point where we said to the client, delivery is obviously something that your customers really care about. How can we actually improve the commercial proposition? Because that could be a key advantage. It's something that your customers care a lot about. And so that's what prompted them to test same-day in-store delivery, because they have hundreds of stores across the UK. And so we were able to test that in a fairly simple way before they'd rolled it out nationwide. We were just able to do that as a fairly simple proof of concept. And we could see that, yes, sure enough, same-day delivery was very popular for them. It was something that the customers appreciated. Yeah. And so we were able to use experimentation to inform something that would become a commercial proposition. And it wasn't like on day one we said to them, you need to test same-day in-store delivery, because they wouldn't have bought it. But because we had, I think it was about 6 months worth of A/B test data to inform it, it gave them the confidence to test it out.
Yeah, and those might not work out financially in the short run either, right? I mean, setting up those delivery networks, and that can be a lot of time and money that you need to invest in it. But once it scales, it starts to make money.
Yeah, exactly so.
So how do you go about determining what's a low versus high risk experiment? What's your process to get more of those high risk ones in?
So there are a couple of different ways that we can do it. In the blog post, I spoke about a fairly kind of simple scoring matrix that you can use. It's one that works for us, and it asks you questions like, essentially, what type of experiment are you running? Are you changing UI or text? Are you changing functionality or pricing? Each of those is likely to have a different type of risk associated to it. You can also look at the potential impact of the experiment even after you've stopped it. So if, suppose we were working with, one of the big fast food restaurants in the UK, and they wanted to test a completely new vegan range of products, for example, and they wanted to do that as a painted door experiment. So they didn't actually have the products. They just wanted to add it to their website and see, would people try and buy this? That is obviously a super high risk experiment. The likelihood is that you probably wouldn't want to run that in the first place, because as soon as people started seeing that, word would get out. People might talk about it on social media. They'd get annoyed if they couldn't buy it. It might get leaked to the press and so on. So that's an example of a test that has an impact even after the test is finished. Yeah. That's obviously a pretty extreme example to illustrate the point. But there are plenty of tests like that we've run at Conversion, where the client is taking a risk beyond the cost of actually building and running the experiment. It could have an impact beyond that. So we've got a kind of a fairly detailed model that allows you to estimate whether something is low, medium, or high risk. But a kind of very simple rule of thumb is essentially to ask yourself the question, if we couldn't A/B test this change, would we still roll it out? Because most of the time, people are testing things that they think are good ideas. And that kind of sounds counterintuitive. Like, why would you not test something that is a good idea? Or why would you test something that you think is a bad idea? But what I mean more is that essentially we only test the things that we think are going to work. We should be testing the ideas where either it will crash and burn and it will tank the conversion rate, or it will have the completely opposite effect. So for one of our clients, one of my favorite examples is when we changed, we worked with a client, a SaaS client, to change their pricing model from one where people paid based on the tiers were structured on functionality, and we changed it to a pricing model based on usage. And if we didn't have A/B testing, would we still make that change? Well, it's hard to say. Probably not, because what they had already was working, but we wanted to see if this was better.
Yeah.
But it would be quite a big risk. It was quite a significant shift. When we did test it, it actually ended up doubling sales, doubling revenue from new customers. So it was hugely successful, but we might not have made that change if we couldn't have A/B tested it.
Marketing budgets have suffered, and the share for A/B testing has been impacted too. If you want to keep testing to enterprise standards, but save 80% on your annual contract, you can consider Convert.com. With their summer release, you can take advantage of full stack and hybrid features, strong privacy compliance, no blink, and enterprise-grade security. Feel good about your smart business decision. Invest what you save back in your CRO program. Check out www.convert.com/2020. So do you for those higher risks? So I can imagine that, if you do that publicly on a public website where maybe millions of people already shop, that can be high risk, maybe even when you release it in small percentages.
Yeah.
So do you move those high risk experiments away from A/B testing to other validation methods? Or maybe use those first?
I mean, ideally, we try and find a way to A/B test it because, we like for something like Pyramid that Tan and the guys at Online Dialogue introduced me to, and it shows essentially that RCTs or A/B tests are the strongest form of evidence you can get, especially when you do the meta-analysis of that from multiple A/B tests. So we would always look to try and find a way to inform that. But it might be that we essentially have to break it down into a simpler concept that's easy to A/B test. So like the medical client with the same day delivery, for example, that might be something that would be too hard for them to do on day one, but we can take steps towards it. And the same as with the if we were working with a fast food restaurant and they wanted to see what would happen if we introduced this vegan range, we might say, well, rather than testing it on an entire range, let's try and it might make sense to test it on an individual product, or even just to see essentially whether we could better signpost existing products that are vegan, for example, and see what effect does that have on customer behavior. It's hard because there's only so much that you can do towards it compared to the benefit of the kind of PR campaign that might go around with actually launching a whole new product range and so on. So it becomes harder to test at that sort of scale. Yeah, that's the challenge.
So we just defined low risk, medium risk, and high risk profiles for experiments. What do you think is a good balance? Is there one way of doing this, or does it totally depend on the situation or the company? Or
I think it depends both on the company and on the situation as well. I think a company should not have the same risk profile all year round, for example. In other words, if you're a retailer and you make 50% of your revenue in November, December, and January, for example, then you might think, well, we need to have a different risk profile for that period than the rest of the year. Yeah. It might be that when you're in peak sales, you want to run no high risk experiments at all because you can't afford to crash the conversion rate. And you should be focusing primarily on low risk experiments. So these are ones that iterate on previous winning concepts, for example. So those are the ones that you focus on doing that during peak period.
It's always a fun discussion, of course, because like I said, you are making 50% of your revenue.
Yeah.
And it might be that, so that's a really important segment of your users that might not shop the rest of the year, but are shopping on that part of the year.
Exactly, yes.
So you do want to optimize. If you want to optimize for something, you should be optimizing for the high peak
100%
part of the year.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we would probably suggest in that instance to skew more towards low and medium risk, and probably not to run the high risk experiments. Yeah, it depends on each company's appetite. I mean, we know firsthand the difference that a higher conversion rate can make. Yeah. If you have a higher conversion rate, and that allows you to afford a higher cost per acquisition, and you can spend more than your competitors to acquire traffic.
Yeah, maybe also how fast your audience and your industry is moving, right? If every year is completely different, you need to keep figuring out, okay, what's working this year?
Yeah.
Well, if you're very traditional business, then might be a totally different story.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for those risk profiles, seasonality, the size of your business, how fast your audience moves. Am I forgetting something?
I would say also the experience that you have in your A/B testing program.
Yeah.
In other words, if you're just getting started, if you've run only a handful of A/B tests before, then you want to probably have a much more balanced profile across low, medium, and high risk. If anything, you might want to skew slightly more towards high risk experiments, because low risk, when you're iterating, that's typically when you're focusing on building on concepts that have already that have won in the past. Whereas if you're just getting started with A/B testing, you don't want to narrow down your focus too early on. You want to make sure that you're having a pretty broad approach to experimentation, that you're testing a wide variety of levers, and you test them in a high impact way, so that you can learn quickly whether or not they work for you and for your customers or not.
Yeah, and I would also assume that there's a high correlation of the test effect size and the risk profile. So higher risk might also mean a higher reward usually. And if you're just starting out with zero, if you're just starting out, my assumption would be you're probably a bit smaller company with less traffic. You're not necessarily used to that. So if you have more high risk experiments, there's a higher chance of you actually finding something.
Totally. Yeah, you have to take those bigger bets.
And in your blog post, you mentioned a couple of ideas to come up with those disruptive ideas. I think that's a big challenge, of course, with many teams.
Yeah.
So how on earth do I find those disruptive ideas? Do I just sit down and brainstorm with my team, or?
Yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely, you can do. I mean, there are a lot of techniques that can work effectively in terms of brainstorming. Like one that we use that I didn't mention in the blog post, in terms of ways to come up with new ideas or more innovative ideas as kind of higher risk concepts. One of my favorites is the idea of invalidating law. Law spelled Lore.
Yeah.
Law is the kind of anecdotal knowledge that exists in your company, the things that you do because that's the way it's always been done. And I got this concept from an interview that Chamath, who used to run the growth team at Facebook, started when he was talking about how Facebook's early success was based on this idea of invalidating law. In other words, find out what do you do in your company because that's the way it's always been, or what do you do in your industry even because that's the way it's always been, and then challenge that and test that assumption to see, is that still valid? Should that still be the case? Because often people, by its nature, they accept that law, that's the way it's always been, that goes unchallenged, and they don't necessarily realize that could be holding you back.
So how do you figure out what the law is? Do you go about interviewing people and then asking them what their assumptions are about their customers, or how things work in their business? Or?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we typically look to challenge when we first start working with a client. We want to go into the details of the product, how they sell it, how they make money from it, how it's structured, and then essentially we look to I guess we want to kind of challenge it in an almost naive way. In other words, we might say, well, why do you do it like this and not like this? And ask questions that are seemingly obvious, but in getting people to explain it, one, it helps to improve our understanding, but secondly, also it highlights some of those opportunities for that to show where people are doing something because that's the way it's always been done.
So trying to figure out law. So I think, especially as an outsider coming in, that helps. I think you notice things like, hey, that's weird, or why on earth are they doing that? And I think interviewing just new hires and asking them, hey, what stood out when you started working for this company?
Nice.
Because as an external agency, you're new, but you're still not necessarily working in the company. Yeah. So you don't necessarily find out what the law is, but interviewing new employees can really help because they're doing this day in, day out, but still are well, they're still new.
Yes.
So they're not, but if you're working there for 5 years, you have no idea what the lore is.
Very true.
Because it disappears.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. I like it.
Yesterday's brainstorm was so good. I really liked Steph's idea of running that test on the call to action buttons. Making them orange will really make them stand out, don't you think?
Yeah, right. Do you want to design real A/B test winners and achieve enormous conversion uplift? Then stop brainstorming and take a scientific approach. If you can read Dutch, follow the steps in Online Invloed, the bestseller on managementbook.nl. Or enroll in the author's course and become an expert in applying proven behavioral science yourself. Go to onlineinfluence.com for more information and free downloads. The second one was divergent thinking.
Yeah, so divergent thinking. This is a lot of people will be familiar with this idea already, even if they're not familiar with the name of it. So divergent thinking is basically like if you've ever been asked an interview question like name as many uses as you can for a brick. That's a perfect example of divergent thinking, because normally they ask you that question and it sounds kind of obvious, but then you have 2 minutes to name as many ideas as you can, and you start off by kind of saying, you know, you could build a house, or you could build a wall, or you could use it as a paperweight on your desk, or you could prop a door open with it. And then after about 30 seconds, you've exhausted all of the obvious ideas that you can think of, and it can start getting to a kind of weird and dark place in terms of, you know, what could you actually do with a brick? And then you're kind of a minute in, and then it kind of gets worse from there.
Yeah,
that's an example of divergent thinking. This is the same kind of principle that's used in the Crazy Eights idea, where you come up with one possible solution and then another, and then you keep on going. And when you get to ideas 6, 7, and 8, because you've exhausted the kind of more obvious ideas first, that's when you start to get to that divergent thinking towards the end. And that can be very effective as a technique that can work well. And
is that then an exercise that you do with the client team or the customers itself, the customers of your client?
So normally we would do that both internally within conversion.com and with our clients. I don't believe it's one that we've ever done with our clients' customers.
Okay.
We typically look to the customer to show us the problem, but not necessarily the solution. Although it's certainly be an interesting idea to try out.
So that's the divergent thinking. And the third one you mentioned in your blog post for creating disruptive ideas is 2x instead of 2%.
Yes, this is kind of what we were talking about a little bit earlier, in that often when you're looking to optimize a page, and I'm certainly guilty of this myself, my tendency is to look at the page and then to think, how could we make that a little bit better? And so from the very start, you're thinking about, you know, how can we get this kind of marginal improvement in performance, as opposed to starting with a more radical question.
And then you get to experiments changing button colors.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas instead you should be asking the question essentially, how could we double the conversion rate?
Yeah.
If you could only run tests that would either double the conversion rate or more or nothing, then what would you test? What would you do differently in your testing program? I think it's quite an interesting thought process to go through, because it completely changes what you're doing. You're not going to kind of stick to the kind of standard concepts and ideas that you might have tested previously. You're going to test something much more radical.
Yeah.
The example that I used in the blog post is one from a company called, I think, Posterous. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. I don't think the company even exists anymore, actually, which is maybe not the best endorsement for this way of thinking. But essentially,
they would have gone away much
exactly.
sooner. If
they haven't done this one weird trick. But what they did really well is, and do take a look at the screenshot in the blog post, because it's going to explain it way better than I ever could. But essentially, they were like kind of similar to like a micro-blogging platform, kind of crossed with Dropbox, I think, that sort of thing. But basically, the way that they improve their registration process, you know, normally you might think, okay, how do you improve your registration process? You could reduce the number of fields. You could tell people why you're asking for the information that you're asking for. You could sell people again on what they're signing up for, so it's not just a functional form. You've also got that motivational content alongside it. You could do all these sorts of things. But what they did is they said, well, actually, just let's skip the registration process altogether. They literally kind of say step 1, register, and they cross it out. Because if you want to host content on their platform, all you have to do is email the content to a given email address, and it automatically creates an account for you based on your email address. And that's it.
Yeah.
That's a great example of that kind of 2x thinking, rather than how could we increase the performance of our registration form by 2%.
Yeah, just remove the registration.
Exactly. And I love that kind of example. I mean, it's the kind of thing that, it makes you kick yourself for thinking like, it's such a good idea. How could I miss that? But then if you do that enough times, and slowly but surely you start to come up with those sorts of ideas yourself as well.
Yeah, exactly. Instead of just having a web shop selling flowers, just send us an email for who you want to send the flowers to, for what location, and we'll handle it. Period.
Yeah, fair point.
Yeah, exactly. Who needs a web shop? Thank you so much for going through the blog post with us. I think this is really interesting to get us out of our daily grid and trying to think of more extreme examples that we can do to actually help our businesses way more than we currently do. So you're obviously already working on evangelizing this and trying to get more companies to do this. So in the next 12 months, what are you doing to help your companies to adopt this even more?
So we're trying to support the clients that we work with to understand the opportunities to run these high risk experiments. Ultimately, it's not on us to push them or force their hand, but essentially to show them this is why you should consider it, and these are the benefits that you could get.
You need to persuade them.
Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, it's they are the clients. It's our job to advise them in the best way possible, but it's on them to decide what they actually want to do. So that means that we have to work hard to essentially show the value in running those sorts of experiments, being prepared to test those kind of ideas, especially if you then do it and it doesn't work. Just because you're running those kind of concepts, it obviously doesn't mean that it's going to work first time or second time or third time. But it's on us to build the business case for that, to show them the potential upside, and then show them how to do it. Basically, how to make it easy, I think, because often people think, like you said at the start, people think that they might have to restructure the whole team if they're going to test X. It's on us to say, this is how we take this kind of big strategic goal that you have. This is an experiment that we think would inform it, and this is how we can do it in a really simple and easy to test way. That's what we need to do to show them how to make this kind of experimentation accessible.
Have you already have a database of enough of those disruptive high risk ideas that you can say, okay, this is roughly the success rate that you can expect from high risk experiments versus low risk or medium risk? Or
so we do have a database of all the experiments that we've run, categorized in Airtable. One thing that we haven't done is categorize them according to risk. The challenge is that talking about risk is only a relatively recent thing for us in this kind of context. Exactly. And it's hard to attribute risk retrospectively, I think. So it's more something that we're trying to build up over time from now.
And would you say that a high risk experiment by definition also takes much more effort and time?
No, not necessarily.
Or not necessarily?
No, I mean, I think a high risk experiment could be very simple. If you wanted to completely change your value proposition or your price or something like, it doesn't have to be a complex experiment to set up. I think that's part of the problem is people think that the higher risk stuff is, it's completely redesign our shopping cart, for example. It doesn't have to be that. A high risk is doesn't need to be correlated to the complexity of the experiment.
Nice. Should be easy to do, relatively easy to do.
100%.
So let's all start looking at our risk profiles and see if we can squeeze in a bit more of those high risk ones.
Easy to do, hard to sign off, I think, is probably the balance that you're looking for.
Steve, a final question. Do you have any CRO related books or other resources that you'd like to mention and tip to our audience? I
don't know. A lot of the books that I've been reading recently are not CRO related,
or more general books that inspire you or help you with your work.
The one that I'm reading or rather listening to when I go running at the moment is Tools of Titans by Tim Ferriss.
Yep.
Which I think, like, you're almost embarrassed to say the name. It's I'm not sure I like the name of the book. It makes you...
It's a bit over the top.
Yeah. But it's really interesting. It kind of talks about, in kind of typical Tim Ferriss style, it talks about, I think, health, wealth, and wisdom are the three kind of sections of the book. And it's essentially summaries of the interviews that he's done on his Tim Ferriss show over the last 5-6 years, however long it is. And it's really interesting in terms of kind of getting a kind of good insight into what other people are doing, what they're thinking, how they work, that sort of thing. And it's so eclectic. You know, I can go for a run and then in a couple of hours we'll have heard from 7 or 8 different people and their beliefs. And so I always come back from my runs with a kind of mental list of 5 or 6 things to follow up on and learn more about. So
is it an actual book that he wrote, or is it just a combination of all the podcasts that he did?
Yeah, this one's just the podcast
kind
of summaries. So he talks about, you know, interviews with Schwarzenegger and Peter Diamandis and you know, you could be listening to someone who's a business expert, and then another one from the Russian guy who popularized kettlebells and how he trains with them. And a lot of it is on kind of attitude and habit and so on. So yeah, it's pretty interesting for me.
Nice. Thank you so much. We'll share that one in the show notes too.
Cool.
And of course, if you want to read more about this topic, and probably you might want to have some visuals to support the story, go to Stephen's blog post on conversion.com. You'll find a lot of extra additional information there.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Stephen.
Thank you.
Bye bye. And this concludes season 2, episode 37 of the Zero Cafe podcast with Stephen Pavlovich from conversion.com. Next week, another English episode in which Elise Mail will take us through the top 6 soft skills you need to rock in order to be great at Zero. Talk to you then, and always be optimizing.